What's going on, bottom line viewers? It is Kev Vole. Happy Saturday to you. And I want to take you back to February 1st, 2015. The Super Bowl between the Seattle Seahawks and the New England Patriots. It was, of course, the Super Bowl, one of the greatest Super Bowls in Glendale, Arizona. The Seattle Seahawks were down 28-24, heading down the field and heading down to the 1 yard line on a last-minute drive with the magic of Russell Wilson, an incredible catch from Chris Matthews, an incredible catch from Jermaine Kearse. After the Patriots came back, this drive, they were at the 1 yard line. We all knew, the 70,000 in the building, the millions watching at home, the New England Patriots coaching staff, New England Patriots players on the bench, the New England players defense, everyone in the entire earth knew that the play was a run. The only two that did not know that were Darrell Bevell, the offensive coordinator of the Seattle Seahawks, and Pete Carroll, the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks. They seemed to be the only two that did not know. They passed the ball. It was intercepted by Malcolm Butler, and the rest, as they say, is history. March 10th, 2015, that led to the trade of the Seattle Seahawks acquiring Jimmy Graham, tight end, for Max Unger, a center, and a first-round draft pick, which turned out to be Stephon Anthony, who now plays with the Miami Dolphins. Now, since then, the Seattle Seahawks seem to have, it's quite obvious to have, that they have an offensive line problem, as well as the questions about Jimmy Graham. And the title of this video is, of course, Should the Seattle Seahawks Trade Jimmy Graham? Now, Mitch asked me when we did the preview on Wednesday why I didn't ask should the Seattle Seahawks trade Richard Sherman. And I'll give an answer to that first, why I think this is more important than Richard Sherman. Because I actually think if you looked at the two players, I think in terms of NFL value, one of the things that we're going to talk about in this video is I think Jimmy Graham actually would carry a higher value or return than Richard Sherman. I think Richard Sherman is a guy that might be getting in the overrated category of many people for the NFL in terms of NFL cornerbacks. And if you remember in the offseason, the Seahawks actually did try to trade Richard Sherman, and they could not get what they wanted for him. So to me, I think Richard Sherman is not a guy that I think you can get as much as you think that you can get for Richard Sherman to address some of the needs of the Seattle Seahawks. Jimmy Graham might be. Tight ends are becoming a focal point in a lot of NFL offenses, and there's a lot of teams that use tight ends in a very different and flexible way. And if you remember, the New York Saints used Jimmy Graham in a different way than the Seattle Seahawks use him, which is part of a topic of this video. But let's get into this a little bit here. Let's look at the 2 seasons that Jimmy Graham has had with the Seattle Seahawks, and give us a little bit of a moment here. But first, let's go back to, we've got 2014, 85 catches, 124 targets, 889 yards in 2014. 2013, he had 1,215. 2011, 1,310 yards for the New Orleans Saints. 2015, although he was placed on injured reserve for the last month of the season and was not in the playoffs, 48 catches, 48 of 73 for 605 yards. Last season with the Seahawks, 65 catches for 923 yards, which of his 4 seasons is actually his 4th best. So far, what we got this season, let's just quickly pull this up here as we're talking. Graham so far had a pretty big impact, of course, on the game in Tennessee late in that game when they were going to, but basically you could feel like it was garbage time. But the game, basically, let's pull this up here from Pro Football Reference as we're talking. 11 catches, 81 yards. There's Antonio Brown had 10 catches and 110 yards in one game. Now, I know that a wide receiver and a tight end isn't the same thing, but Jimmy Graham is considered a high impact and one of the best tight ends or wide receivers in the NFL. Certainly was productive and one of the key focal points in New Orleans, and it isn't quite the same in Seattle. Now, there's a number of reasons probably for that. The idea that the identity of the Seattle Seahawks has been run first, but this season, it's different. And quite frankly, 3 weeks into the season, We don't know what the Seahawks' identity is. The first 6 plays of the Tennessee Titans game were all pass plays, which is quite strange for a team that runs. That's typically supposed to run, but they couldn't really get that run game going against an elite team like the Tennessee Titans. Once Doug Baldwin went down with a groin injury, Jimmy Graham seemed to be a focal point. So it leads to a couple of questions here. What's going on here with Jimmy Graham? And I think it's part of the problem is and one of the key things is I don't think Darrell Bevell has known really how to use a guy like Jimmy Graham. He hasn't used him in a really great way. He's maybe kept him back a little bit. He doesn't use him a lot in the end zone, but in the red zone. Sorry, not the end zone. Getting into the end zone in the red zone. There's still there for the last 2 seasons. Quite frankly, there has been a lot of confusion. I think in terms of what they're supposed to be doing in the red zone. It got so bad last season, if you remember. Richard Sherman actually got into a fight with Darrell Bevell on a Thursday night game against the Rams, discussing what the heck you're doing. And the target on that play, incidentally enough, was Jimmy Graham. So I think that there's a lot of confusion between Darrell Bevell, Jimmy Graham, and Russell Wilson. How exactly to use this guy in the offense? They do seem to use the wide receivers in a lot of the streak routes, and Wilson is able to conduct those or throw those deep passes, but they can't seem to find Jimmy Graham a lot. Now, it could be that he's covered a little bit more because they know that he's key, but it also seems to me that he's not really a guy that has been targeted. Now, some say that Jimmy Graham is actually not a great pass route runner. I've heard that criticism of him. But what happened then between in New Orleans and in Seattle for that to change? He was able to find himself inside, he was able to find himself outside, and he was able to get into a number of different routes that they found. Breeze used him a lot on play action, and it seemed a little bit like he was effective there in a key point in that offense, even though there was a number of weapons that Drew Brees had his options to go through, wide receivers and tight ends. Brees found a way to get him the ball. Sean Payton found a way to get this guy the ball. And the offense in Seattle can't. This is a guy that's actually a former basketball player that you can position and move in a number of different ways. And they haven't been able to do that. So I think part of the problem, the question here before we get into as we get into this, if the Seahawks should trade Jimmy Graham, is what is the identity of the Seattle Seahawks? The second part of this is the obvious problem here in Seattle has been the offensive line. And you almost could look to March 10th, 2015, as well as February 1st, 2015, quite frankly, as the day that changed the Seahawks world. February 1st, 2015, for obvious reasons, they lost the heartbreaking Super Bowl on probably one of the toughest Super Bowl calls in NFL history. Mitch Milani, for the bottom line view, may disagree with that, but that's fact. But March 10th, 2015, you traded one of your best offensive linemen to get this guy, Jimmy Graham, and your offensive line has not stepped up. You've lost Russell Okung since then. You could not get TJ Lang signed. You couldn't get Andrew Whitworth signed. By the way, Andrew Whitworth, incidentally enough, would have cost as much as Eddie Lacy and Luke Joeckel. And Eddie Lacy is sitting on the bench in the Pine, making about $4 to $5 million. Luke Joeckel has struggled as on the left side of the offensive line for the Seattle Seahawks. Just putting this out there as a side point. But who would be interested in a guy like Jimmy Graham? Where would Jimmy Graham prosper here? Sorry, let me get back to the offensive line here for a second as we get through this. You haven't been able to address that, really. You've brought in some veterans, but nothing really concrete and solid. Not that guy, not that offense, not that Taylor Lewan as an example, or the guy in the Dallas offensive line. Not that guy that can make a difference on the offensive line. You don't have it. You've got Ibushi, you've got Ifedi, you got Oyambo, but they're good. They're not great. That's the problem. And as a unit, of course, they're going to have to get better, obviously, if the Seattle Seahawks need to have any success. But who would be interested in Jimmy Graham? I'm going to throw out a few options here for you. The Baltimore Ravens would be an interesting option because they know how to use tight ends. You look at a guy like Benjamin Watson. He's been very prosperous there, and Dennis Pitta had a great career there. A guy like Jimmy Graham would do excellent in Baltimore, and you can get a pretty... They have some offensive linemen available. So there's options available, and possibly a pretty higher draft pick. The Denver Broncos would also be a really good option too. They're a team that used the tight end very well, and their defense is excellent, and they've always had a really strong offensive line, so there's some pieces there that I could see a deal. How about the New England Patriots? Now, I know that sounds really weird when you got a guy like Rob Gronkowski, but Gronk's been hurt a lot, and Graham off and on has been hurt, but he doesn't have the injury concerns that Rob Gronkowski had. But he would be a very interesting option in that New England offense, especially losing a guy like Julian Edelman. You can move him inside, you can move him outside, you can use him in a number of different ways. That would be another option as well. What about back to New Orleans? Would New Orleans be interested in this guy? They would find a way to... Certainly, I think Jimmy Graham wouldn't mind playing with Drew Brees again. And maybe even, let's throw another one out here just for the sake of this, although... And simply because they don't have any bodies left to play football. There may be people behind me that Green Bay may be calling. The Green Bay Packers. Can you imagine Aaron Rodgers and Jimmy Graham together? That would be an interesting combination. But ultimately to me, and I'm hoping you guys can comment on the YouTube video here and you say what you think, but I would not do it this yet. I think especially when you got a guy like Doug Baldwin with a groin injury that could be very questionable against Indianapolis, the Seahawks, in the midst of this offensive identity, seem to be in a battle to move to a more up-tempo way. And when they were up-tempo against the Tennessee Titans, it seemed to work a little bit, and they were able to get Jimmy Graham a little bit more involved in the offense. So I think at this point, I would hold off on trading Jimmy Graham and seeing what you can, finding ways to get him more involved and get him revolving your game plan or including your game plan in with Jimmy Graham, moving that ball up the middle, maybe perhaps try to move Jimmy Graham to the wide receiver position. The Seahawks are not that strong in wide receiver. They've got Lockett, they've got Richardson, they're okay, but if you can move Graham to the outside, that creates a lot more matchup problems, and possibly when Baldwin is healthy, that creates another matchup problem for people to think about. I know that this may be a new concept for Darrell Bevell, but hey, whatever, hey. So for me right now, I would actually hold off on trading Jimmy Graham, but I would love to know what you think. Comment below on the YouTube video. Thanks for subscribing. If you have not, Jimmy Graham or Gronk, spike that like, as Mitch says, and follow more videos. This is the Saturday video here for week 4. I'm Kev Ole. You are you. We're out.